The Riverside City Police Department briefing room falls silent. Officer Garrett Sullivan freezes mid-smirk as the man he beat and handcuffed an hour ago walks through the door in full dress uniform. Captain's bars gleam on his shoulders. Command presence fills the room. "Good morning," the man says calmly, standing at the front. "I'm Captain Isaiah Hunter. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." Sullivan's face drains of color. His hands tremble as he remembers every detail of the routine stop that went wrong 60 minutes earlier, the black man walking through the neighborhood. The suspicious behavior that justified the stop. The escalation. The baton strikes when the man resisted. The handcuffs. The booking process. All captured on body camera, all documented, all against the man who now commands the entire department. Before we begin, Chief Hunter continues, his eyes finding Sullivan in the crowd. "I believe Officer Sullivan and I need to have a conversation about proper procedure, constitutional rights, and what happens when officers abuse their authority." The room erupts in whispers. Everyone knows Sullivan's reputation for aggressive tactics. No one knew his latest victim would be their new boss, and justice is about to be served. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 hours earlier, Captain Isaiah Hunter had driven into Riverside City with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. At 42, he was about to assume command of a police department with documented problems, excessive force complaints, community distrust, and a culture that had resisted reform for decades. Mayor Catherine Brennan had recruited him specifically to transform the department, believing his combination of street experience and progressive leadership philosophy could bridge the divide between effective policing and community trust. Hunter's credentials were impressive. 20 years in law enforcement, starting as a patrol officer in Detroit and rising through the ranks while earning a master's degree in criminal justice and completing the FBI's National Academy program. His previous position as captain of community policing in Columbus, Ohio, had reduced crime rates by 23%, while simultaneously decreasing use of force incidents by 41%. He had pioneered de-escalation, training programs now used by departments nationwide, and had testified before Congress about constitutional policing practices, but statistics and credentials couldn't fully prepare him for the cultural transformation he was about to undertake in Riverside City. The department had been shaken by recent scandals, viral videos of excessive force, a Justice Department investigation into discriminatory practices, and community protests demanding accountability. The previous chief, William Grayson, had retired under pressure after 30 years, leaving behind a department divided between officers who recognized the need for change and those who viewed reform as betrayal. Mayor Brennan had been blunt during Hunter's final interview. "This department has good officers who are demoralized by bad leadership and a toxic culture that protects the worst among them. I need someone who can restore community trust while supporting the majority of officers who do their jobs with integrity." Hunter had accepted the position, understanding the challenges ahead. His wife, Angela, an emergency room physician, had supported the move despite knowing it would uproot their family. Their daughter Naomi, 16, and son Elijah, 13, had been less enthusiastic about leaving their friends in Columbus. But Hunter had promised them this opportunity could make a real difference in a community that desperately needed leadership committed to constitutional policing. The decision to arrive in Riverside City a day early and explore the community. Incognito had been deliberate. Hunter wanted to experience the city as a civilian rather than as a commanding officer, to understand how residents and officers interacted without the artificial formality that his position would create. He had dressed casually in jeans and a jacket, deliberately choosing to walk through neighborhoods where police-community relations were reportedly most strained. His morning had been spent walking through the East Side neighborhood, observing interactions, noting the mix of working-class families, small businesses, and the visible signs of economic struggle that characterized many Midwestern cities. Store owners greeted him politely, children played in parks with varying degrees of supervision, and the rhythm of daily life seemed unremarkable. What Hunter was specifically observing were the subtle signs of how residents responded to police presence. When patrol cars drove through, he noticed how some people tensed slightly, how parents called their children closer, how the atmosphere shifted in ways that suggested wariness rather than reassurance. These micro-responses told him more about police-community relations than any official report could capture. He had stopped at Ahmad Hassan's convenience store to buy coffee, engaging the owner in casual conversation about the neighborhood. Hassan, an immigrant from Jordan who had owned the store for 15 years, had been cautiously forthcoming about his experiences with local police. "Most officers are professional," Hassan had explained, "but there are some who see us as problems to be managed rather than citizens to be protected. The aggressive ones create fear that affects how everyone views the department." This insight confirmed what Hunter's research had already suggested. The department's problems weren't universal misconduct, but rather a failure to hold problem officers accountable, creating a culture where aggressive tactics were tolerated and community complaints were dismissed. As Hunter left the store and continued his walk, he was mentally cataloging observations and formulating preliminary strategies for addressing the cultural issues he would inherit. His focus on analysis and planning meant he wasn't paying attention to how his presence might be perceived by patrol officers who didn't know who he was. Officer Garrett Sullivan and his partner Derek Mason were conducting their morning patrol with the casual arrogance that came from 10 years of operating in a department that rarely questioned their methods. Sullivan had accumulated 17 complaints over his career, all dismissed during internal review processes that gave officers the benefit of the doubt even when evidence suggested excessive force. When Sullivan spotted a black man in casual clothes walking through a predominantly white neighborhood, his assumptions took over. Years of biased training and department culture that emphasized proactive policing in certain communities had conditioned him to see routine behavior as suspicious when performed by someone whose race didn't match neighborhood demographics. "Check out this guy," Sullivan told Mason, slowing the patrol car. "Doesn't belong in this neighborhood." The decision to conduct what Sullivan called a street interview would set in motion a confrontation that would expose everything wrong with the department's culture and practices. Though neither officer had any idea they were about to assault the man who would be commanding them within hours. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Officer Sullivan pulled the patrol car alongside Isaiah Hunter as he walked down Maple Street, a tree-lined residential area 3 blocks from Hassan's convenience store. Hunter noticed the vehicle slowing but continued walking at a steady pace, his mind still processing observations about community dynamics rather than anticipating what was about to unfold. "Excuse me. Sir, can I speak with you for a moment?" Sullivan called through the open window, his tone already carrying an edge of challenge rather than professional courtesy. Hunter stopped and turned, recognizing the familiar dynamics of a police stop. After 20 years in law enforcement, he understood both the officer's perspective and the citizen's vulnerability during such encounters. He also understood that his race significantly increased the likelihood of the interaction escalating unnecessarily. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Hunter replied calmly, keeping his hands visible and his demeanor non-threatening, the same advice he would give to any citizen stopped by police. Sullivan exited the vehicle, his body language aggressive rather than cautious. His partner Mason emerged from the passenger side, positioning himself at an angle that suggested tactical training rather than conversation. The coordination spoke to practiced patterns, routine stops conducted hundreds of times before. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood, Sullivan lied. A tactic he employed regularly to justify stops that lacked legitimate probable cause. Can I see some identification? Hunter considered his options carefully. As a citizen, he had Fourth Amendment rights that didn't require him to provide identification for a stop lacking reasonable suspicion. As a law enforcement professional, he understood that asserting those rights might escalate an encounter with officers who viewed challenges to their authority as threatening. What specific suspicious activity are you investigating? Hunter asked, keeping his tone respectful while gently pushing back on the questionable legal basis for the stop. This question immediately irritated Sullivan, who interpreted it as resistance rather than reasonable inquiry about the legal justification for the encounter. I'm asking the questions here. Show me your ID, or we're going to have a problem. Mason shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that his partner was escalating unnecessarily, but unwilling to intervene. The culture of loyalty among officers meant that questioning a colleague's tactics was often viewed as betrayal, even when those tactics violated constitutional principles. Hunter slowly reached for his wallet, his movements deliberately visible to avoid any claim of threatening behavior. I'm reaching for my identification in my back pocket, he narrated, following protocols designed to prevent tragic misunderstandings. Don't tell me what you're doing, Sullivan snapped, his hand moving toward his service weapon despite Hunter's obviously non-threatening compliance. Just do what I tell you. The unnecessary aggression confirmed Hunter's assessment of the department's cultural problems. This officer was conducting a street stop with an attitude of dominance rather than community service, treating a citizen engaged in routine activity as a potential criminal deserving of intimidation. Hunter produced his wallet and extracted his driver's license, handing it to Sullivan while maintaining careful control of his emotional response to being subjected to the kind of biased policing he had spent his career trying to reform. Sullivan examined the ID, noting Hunter's Columbus, Ohio address. You're not from around here. What are you doing in this neighborhood? Walking, Hunter replied simply, declining to explain that he was the incoming police chief conducting a community assessment. The decision to maintain his civilian status was deliberate. This encounter would provide invaluable insight into how the department's problem officers operated without supervision or accountability. Walking, Sullivan repeated mockingly, in a neighborhood where you don't know anyone, in an area where we've had break-ins. That's suspicious behavior. The logic was circular and discriminatory. Hunter's presence was suspicious because he didn't belong. And he didn't belong because Sullivan had decided his race made him suspicious in this particular neighborhood. It was precisely the kind of biased policing that eroded community trust and violated constitutional principles. Officer, I'm simply exercising my right to walk on a public street, Hunter said calmly. I haven't violated any laws or ordinances. Is there a specific crime you're investigating that gives you reasonable suspicion to detain me? The question, perfectly reasonable from a legal standpoint, pushed Sullivan past his already thin tolerance for challenges to his authority. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting lawful orders. The charges were fabricated. Hunter had neither obstructed justice nor resisted any lawful orders. But Sullivan had learned that vague charges like obstruction and resisting could be applied to almost any interaction where a citizen questioned police authority, and that the department's internal review process rarely challenged such arrests. Even when evidence was thin, Hunter made a split-second decision that would test both his commitment to constitutional principles and his ability to remain calm under The precise kind of abuse he was being hired to eliminate. "Officer, I'm not resisting. I'm simply asking about the legal basis for this detention." "That's my constitutional right," Sullivan responded, with immediate and excessive force, grabbing Hunter's arm and twisting it behind his back with unnecessary violence. When Hunter instinctively tensed his muscles to prevent injury, a natural physiological response, not intentional resistance, Sullivan interpreted the reaction as defiance. "He's resisting," Sullivan shouted, signaling to Mason while pulling out his baton. The strike came swiftly across Hunter's shoulder blades, followed by a second blow to his lower back when Hunter bent forward from the first impact. Ahmad Hassan, the store owner Hunter had spoken with earlier, witnessed the assault from across the street and immediately pulled out his phone to record. Bethany Carter, a customer leaving a nearby coffee shop, also began filming, horrified by the obvious excessive force being applied to a citizen who appeared to be complying with police orders. Within 30 seconds, Hunter was face down on the sidewalk, handcuffed with his hands secured behind his back, his shoulder and back throbbing from the baton strikes, and his calm demeanor tested by the humiliation of being assaulted by the kind of officer he would soon be responsible for supervising. Sullivan stood over him, breathing heavily from adrenaline rather than exertion, already formulating the arrest report that would justify his actions through carefully chosen language about aggressive, resistance, and officer safety concerns that would be difficult to disprove without video evidence. What Sullivan didn't know was that his body camera had captured everything, that civilian witnesses were recording from multiple angles, and that the man he had just assaulted would be reviewing that footage as his commanding officer before the day ended. The booking process at Riverside City Police Department Central Station followed the routine protocols that Hunter knew intimately from his 20 years in law enforcement, but experiencing them as a victim of excessive force rather than as an investigating officer provided a perspective he had never fully understood. Sergeant Kyle Bradshaw processed the arrest paperwork with the casual efficiency of someone who had seen hundreds of similar bookings. Sullivan's report described Hunter as aggressively resistant, requiring physical force to ensure officer safety and secure compliance. The language was carefully crafted to suggest threat without making specific claims that video evidence might contradict. Another one of Sullivan's attitude adjustments, the booking officer muttered to a colleague, just loudly enough for Hunter to overhear. The comments suggested this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a recognized pattern. Sullivan regularly used force against citizens whose only crime was questioning his authority. Hunter remained silent throughout processing, observing how the system handled arrestees. The booking officer never asked about his injuries from the baton strikes, never inquired whether medical attention was needed, never showed any skepticism about an arrest report that described a 42-year-old man in business casual clothing as presenting a significant officer safety risk. "You've got one phone call," Bradshaw informed him, gesturing toward the wall-mounted phone in the holding area. "Make it count." Hunter's first instinct was to call his wife Angela, who would be arriving in Riverside City that afternoon with their children to begin settling into their new home. But revealing his identity now would trigger immediate departmental response and potentially interfere with his ability to experience the system's flaws firsthand. Instead, he called his brother Lawrence, a civil rights attorney in Chicago who specialized in police misconduct cases. Lawrence would understand the strategic value of letting the situation develop while ensuring proper legal representation and documentation. "Lawrence, I need you to listen carefully without reacting," Hunter began when his brother answered. "I've been arrested by Riverside City PD. The charges are false, the force was excessive, but I need you to let this play out for the next few hours. I start as chief tomorrow morning, and this experience is showing me exactly what we're dealing with." Lawrence, accustomed to his brother's strategic thinking, suppressed his immediate outrage, and shifted into professional mode. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Baton strikes to the shoulder and back. "Painful but not serious. What I need is for you to document everything without revealing my identity yet. Contact the department in about 2 hours, requesting body camera footage and booking records for an Isaiah Hunter arrested this morning. Make it a routine public records request. Nothing that suggests I'm anything other than a private citizen." The strategic approach would create a paper trail while allowing Hunter to observe how the department handled misconduct complaints and public accountability requests. If officials stonewalled or lost footage, that information would be valuable for the reforms he was planning. In the holding cell, Hunter found himself sharing space with 3 other men awaiting arraignment. A reflection of the department's aggressive arrest policies that filled cells with minor offenders who could have been issued citations instead. One cellmate, a man in his 50s with the weathered appearance of chronic homelessness, recognized the signs of excessive force in Hunter's careful movements. "Sullivan gets you too." The question confirmed what Hunter had already suspected. This officer's brutality was well known among community members who bore the brunt of his aggressive tactics. "You know him." "Everyone on the east side knows Sullivan. He likes to teach people respect, if you know what I mean. Internal affairs never does nothing about it, though. Complaints just disappear." This information aligned with the Justice Department investigation findings that Hunter had reviewed during his interview process. The department's internal accountability mechanisms were broken, with complaints routinely dismissed, and officers with multiple violations protected by a union contract that made discipline nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Ahmad Hassan and Bethany Carter had arrived at the police station separately, both demanding to file witness statements about the excessive force they had observed. The desk sergeant, following departmental custom, took their names and contact information, but showed no interest in actually documenting their accounts. "Someone will follow up with you," the sergeant assured them dismissively. Knowing that such follow-up rarely occurred unless media attention or legal action forced departmental response, Hassan, however, was not deterred by bureaucratic dismissal. As an immigrant who had experienced discrimination firsthand, he understood the importance of documentation and persistence. He had already uploaded his video to multiple platforms and contacted investigative reporter Christina Bell at the local newspaper, who had been covering the department's misconduct patterns for months. Bell arrived at the station within 30 minutes, her reporter's instincts recognizing that Hassan's video might be the evidence needed to break through the department's protective culture. She began requesting public information about the arrest while calling contacts within the department who might provide context. Off the record, this is going to be bigger than the usual excessive force complaint, Bell told her editor after reviewing the footage. The victim appears to be a professional middle-aged man walking in broad daylight who gets assaulted for asking legitimate questions about the legal basis for his detention. It's textbook constitutional violation, all caught on civilian video. What Bell didn't yet know was that the victim was the incoming chief who would be taking command the following morning, or that the scandal she was documenting would trigger the departmental transformation that city leadership had been demanding for years. Back in the holding cell, Hunter continued gathering information through casual conversation with his cellmates, learning about the patterns of arrests, the officers with worst reputations, and the communities most affected by aggressive policing. Every piece of information would inform his reform strategy once he assumed command. At 3 p.m., Lawrence Hunter arrived at the station in his capacity as legal counsel, demanding immediate release of his client and preservation of all evidence related to the arrest. His professional demeanor and knowledge of constitutional law immediately shifted how desk personnel treated the case. "Your client will be processed and released on his own. Recognizance," the desk sergeant informed Lawrence after checking with supervisors. Arraignment is scheduled for next month. I'll also need all body camera footage from the arresting officers. Booking camera footage and any witness statements taken in connection with this arrest, Lawrence added, establishing the formal record that would later prove crucial. The requests triggered consultation with the department's legal counsel, who recognized potential liability but didn't yet understand the full scope of what was unfolding. The decision to comply with the records request rather than stonewall would prove fortuitous for the department's credibility during the aftermath. As Hunter was processed for release, having spent nearly 4 hours in custody for the crime of walking while black in a neighborhood where Officer Sullivan decided he didn't belong, he reflected on how this experience had provided more insight into the department's cultural problems than any amount of research or interviews could have generated. Tomorrow morning, he would walk into that same police station as the commanding officer with first-hand knowledge of exactly how broken the system was and precisely which reforms were most urgent. The officers who had processed him as a criminal would learn they had been documenting their own department's failures under the supervision of their incoming chief. While Isaiah Hunter sat in a holding cell, experiencing firsthand the department's broken culture, Mayor Catherine Brennan was in her office preparing for the press conference, announcing his appointment as Chief of Police. At 54, Brennan had made police reform the centerpiece of her administration after winning election on a platform of accountability and community trust. The decision to recruit Hunter had been strategic. After conducting a national search that attracted over 40 candidates, Brennan had been impressed by Hunter's combination of street credibility and progressive leadership philosophy. His record in Columbus demonstrated that constitutional policing and crime reduction weren't mutually exclusive. Properly trained officers using de-escalation tactics and community partnership actually improved public safety outcomes. Mayor, "We have a developing situation," her chief of staff interrupted, holding a tablet displaying Ahmad Hassan's video of Hunter's arrest. "This footage is starting to go viral on social media. It appears to show another excessive force incident by one of our officers." Brennan watched the video with growing alarm, recognizing the pattern she had campaigned against. Unnecessary stop. Escalation over routine questioning, excessive force against a compliant citizen. "Do we know who the victim is? Has he filed a complaint?" His attorney made a public records request identifying him as Isaiah Hunter, but we're still confirming details. The name triggered immediate recognition in Brennan's mind. "Isaiah Hunter? That's our incoming chief. Get me the police commissioner immediately." Within minutes, Brennan had confirmed her worst fear. The man Riverside City had recruited to reform the police department had been arrested and assaulted by the very officers he would soon be commanding. The irony was almost too perfect, but the implications were profound. Police Commission Chair Denise Harper rushed to Brennan's office after receiving the emergency summons. As a civilian oversight advocate who had fought for years to hold the department accountable, Harper recognized both the crisis and the opportunity this incident represented. "This is either the worst possible start to Chief Hunter's tenure or the best illustration of why we hired him," Harper observed after reviewing the video. "How we handle this will determine whether the department takes reform seriously." Meanwhile, at FBI field office across town, Special Agent Nicole Warren was conducting routine review of civil rights violation complaints when Hassan's video crossed her desk. The Bureau had been monitoring Riverside City PD as part of a broader investigation into patterns of discriminatory policing. And this incident fit concerning trends they had been documenting. "We need to preserve all evidence related to this arrest," Warren told her supervisor. "This could be the case that breaks the pattern wide open, especially if the victim is willing to press federal charges." Warren had no idea yet that the victim was about to assume command of the department, but her instinct about the case's significance was accurate. This incident would indeed become the catalyst for comprehensive federal intervention and reform. At the Riverside City Gazette, investigative reporter Christina Bell was fact-checking Hassan's account and cross-referencing Officer Sullivan's history. What she discovered was damning. 17 previous complaints of excessive force, all dismissed during internal review, with disturbing patterns of stops concentrated in minority neighborhoods. This isn't just one bad apple, Bell told her editor. This is systematic failure of accountability mechanisms that allow officers like Sullivan to brutalize citizens without consequence. The story Bell was developing would be published the following morning, perfectly timed to coincide with the revelation of Hunter's identity and creating a media firestorm that would force immediate departmental response. Deputy Chief Arnold Fisher, who had been serving as interim commander since Chief Grayson's retirement, was in a conference call with the police union president Dennis Crawford when he received word about the Hunter arrest. "This is going to be a disaster," Fisher told Crawford. "The new chief gets beaten by one of our officers on his first day in town. The reformers are going to use this to push through every change they've been demanding." Crawford's response reflected the union's defensive posture toward any accountability measures. Sullivan was following his training and department protocols. If this Hunter character had simply complied with lawful orders, instead of questioning the officer's authority, none of this would have happened. The conversation revealed the deep cultural divide within the department, between those who recognized the need for reform and those who viewed any accountability as attack on officers doing a difficult job under challenging circumstances. What neither Fisher nor Crawford had considered was that Hunter's experience as a victim of excessive force would provide him with moral authority and practical insight that no amount of research or training could replicate. When he began implementing reforms, he would speak not just as an administrator, but as someone who had personally experienced the consequences of the culture he was charged with. Transforming City Attorney Gerald Preston was already calculating the legal exposure from Sullivan's assault. "We're looking at potential federal civil rights violations, excessive force claims, and possibly even criminal charges. The video evidence is overwhelming, but Preston's primary concern was liability to the city, not the broader implications for police-community relations or the opportunity for meaningful reform. His narrow legal focus would prove inadequate for addressing the cultural transformation that the situation demanded." As afternoon shifted toward evening, the various threads of response and investigation were converging toward the following morning's press conference, when all parties would discover that the routine excessive force incident they were analyzing had actually been an assault on their incoming police chief. The convergence would transform a local police brutality story into a national conversation about accountability reform and what happens when the guardians of the system experience firsthand the failures they're supposed to address. Isaiah Hunter was released from custody at 6:02 p.m. after nearly 8 hours of experiencing the department's booking process, holding cell conditions, and bureaucratic indifference that characterized how the system treated routine arrestees. His brother Lawrence met him at the station's front entrance, where Christina Bell and her photographer were waiting to document his release. "Mr. Hunter, can you tell us what happened during your arrest?" Bell asked, her recorder ready to capture his response. Hunter made a strategic decision in that moment. Honesty about the experience without revealing his identity would create a more powerful narrative than claiming authority prematurely. "I was walking through a neighborhood, exercising my constitutional right to use public streets, when Officer Sullivan stopped me without reasonable suspicion. When I asked about the legal basis for his detention, he responded with violence. The statement was clear, factual, and damning." Bell recognized the precision of his language. This wasn't an emotional complaint, but a measured legal assessment, delivered by someone who understood constitutional law intimately. "What do you want to see happen to the officer involved?" Bell pressed. "I want accountability," Hunter replied. "Not just for me, but for every person who's experienced similar treatment but lacked resources or documentation to seek justice. This pattern has to end." Lawrence drove his brother to the hotel where Hunter's family was waiting, having arrived in Riverside City that afternoon for what they had thought would be a celebratory start to his new position. Instead, Angela Hunter found her husband bruised, emotionally drained, and carrying insights about the department's problems that no briefing could have provided. "The culture is worse than we thought," Hunter told Angela as she examined the bruises from Sullivan's baton strikes. "Officers who commit clear constitutional violations face no consequences. The booking process treats arrestees like criminals to be processed rather than citizens with rights. And the supervisory chain either doesn't know or doesn't care about what happens on the streets." Angela, with her emergency room experience treating victims of police violence, understood the depth of the cultural failure her husband was describing. "Tomorrow, when you take command, you'll have first-hand knowledge and moral authority that no other chief could match. Use it." That evening, Hunter and Lawrence developed a strategic response that would transform his personal victimization into systemic reform. Rather than seeking quiet resolution or immediate retaliation, they would document everything, preserve all evidence, and use the incident as a catalyst for comprehensive departmental transformation. "We go public with your identity tomorrow morning at the press conference," Lawrence advised. "Let them introduce you as the new chief, then reveal that you're also the victim in the viral assault video. The contrast between their ceremonial welcome and their actual treatment of you will be impossible to ignore." Meanwhile, Mayor Brennan was coordinating her own strategic response after confirming Hunter's identity. She called an emergency meeting with Hunter at his hotel, where they discussed how to handle the revelation and maximize its impact for reform. "This incident is terrible, but it's also an opportunity," Brennan told Hunter. "You now have undeniable evidence of the problems we hired you to fix. How do you want to proceed?" Hunter outlined a comprehensive response that would address both his individual case and the systematic failures it exposed. Immediate suspension of Officer Sullivan pending investigation, full federal civil rights review of the department, mandatory retraining for all officers on constitutional policing and de-escalation, and most importantly, fundamental restructuring of internal accountability mechanisms that had allowed officers like Sullivan to brutalize citizens without consequence. "I want to make it clear this isn't about personal revenge," Hunter emphasized. "This is about using a documented constitutional violation to force changes that should have been implemented years ago." Police Commission Chair Harper joined the meeting, bringing data that placed Hunter's experience in broader context. In the past 3 years, Officer Sullivan has been involved in 17 excessive force complaints, all dismissed during internal review. He operates in a department culture that protects problem officers rather than holding them accountable. The strategic response they developed would reveal Hunter's identity in the most dramatic way possible, allowing him to walk into the department briefing room the morning after his assault and take command as the chief whose first act would be investigating his own beating by one of his officers. At FBI headquarters, Agent Warren was developing her own strategic approach after learning the victim's identity through law enforcement channels. "This gives us federal jurisdiction and probable cause to expand our investigation beyond this single incident to department-wide practices. The convergence of mayoral authority, FBI oversight, community advocacy, and media scrutiny was creating an accountability mechanism that the department's traditional protective culture couldn't resist or deflect. Sullivan's assault had inadvertently triggered the comprehensive reckoning that reformers had sought for years. The morning briefing at Riverside City Police Department was scheduled for 7 a.m., standard procedure for shift changes and departmental announcements. Officer Garrett Sullivan arrived early, confident that his arrest report would protect him from scrutiny over yesterday's routine. Stop that required force to ensure compliance. Sergeant Bradshaw had reviewed Sullivan's paperwork and found it acceptable by the department's lax standards. The fact that the arrestee had been released without charges being filed was unremarkable. Prosecutors frequently declined to prosecute arrests lacking solid evidence. But that didn't trigger internal review of the officer's conduct. Heard you had to tune up another one yesterday, a colleague commented to Sullivan as officers gathered for the briefing. These people need to learn respect. The casual conversation reflected the culture Hunter was about to confront: excessive force, treated as acceptable attitude adjustment, rather than constitutional violation requiring discipline and retraining. At 6:55 a.m., Mayor Brennan entered the building through the front entrance, accompanied by Police Commission Chair Harper and several city officials. Their formal presence suggested something more significant than routine administrative announcements, creating nervous speculation among gathered officers. Deputy Chief Fisher stood at the front of the briefing room, prepared to introduce the new chief he had never met. The plan had been for a ceremonial welcome, friendly remarks about cooperation and transition, then regular duty assignments. Instead, Fisher was about to witness the most dramatic revelation of his 30-year career. At precisely 7 a.m., Isaiah Hunter entered the briefing room through the rear door, the same entrance used for prisoners being transported from holding cells to court appearances. The symbolism was deliberate. He wore his full-dress uniform, captain's bars gleaming, service ribbons telling the story of 20 years of distinguished law enforcement career. The whispers started immediately. As officers recognized the man several of them had processed through booking just 18 hours earlier, Sullivan's face drained of color as he realized the impossible. The citizen he had beaten and arrested was walking toward the front of the room in command uniform. "Good morning," Hunter began, his voice carrying calm authority that silenced the murmurs. "I'm Captain Isaiah Hunter. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." The revelation hit Sullivan with physical force. His hands began trembling, his breathing became shallow, and his mind raced through the implications of having assaulted his new commanding officer. Before we discuss departmental policies and my vision for this department's future, I want to address what happened to me yesterday at approximately 10:30 a.m. on Maple Street. Hunter gestured to the screen behind him, where Christina Bell's video began playing. The footage showed the entire encounter: Sullivan's initial stop, lacking reasonable suspicion, Hunter's calm compliance and reasonable questions, Sullivan's escalation to violence, and the baton strikes against a citizen who was clearly not resisting. This video documents Officer Sullivan assaulting me, your new chief, while I was conducting a community assessment before officially taking command. But more importantly, it documents the kind of constitutional violation that happens regularly in this department without accountability. The room was absolutely silent. Officers who had been skeptical of the reform-minded chief now watched their worst fears confirmed. He wasn't just advocating for change abstractly. He had personally experienced the brutality that community members had been complaining about for years. "Officer Sullivan," Hunter said, making direct eye contact with the officer who was visibly shaking, "you are suspended immediately pending full investigation by both Internal Affairs and the FBI. Sergeant Bradshaw, you are also suspended for approving a clearly deficient arrest report and failing to question obvious constitutional violations." The swift action sent shockwaves through officers accustomed to protective culture that shielded misconduct. Several shifted uncomfortably, wondering whether their own questionable actions would face similar scrutiny. "Let me be clear about what's going to change in this department," Hunter continued. "We will enforce constitutional rights, not violate them. We will use force only when necessary, not as punishment for citizens who question our authority. We will hold ourselves to the same legal standards we enforce against others." Deputy Chief Fisher stood frozen, realizing that the transition he had expected to manage was actually a revolution that would transform every aspect of departmental culture. For those officers who are committed to constitutional policing and community service, you will find I'm your strongest advocate. For those who think the badge gives you authority to brutalize citizens without accountability, you should start looking for other careers. The power shift was complete and irreversible. What had begun as routine excessive force by an officer, accustomed to impunity, had become the catalyst for comprehensive departmental transformation under a chief who could speak from personal experience about the consequences of unchecked police brutality. Within 72 hours of Chief Hunter's dramatic revelation, the consequences of Officer Sullivan's assault cascaded through multiple levels of law enforcement, government, and community institutions. The incident that Sullivan had treated as routine attitude adjustment became the catalyst for systematic reform that transformed the entire department. The FBI's civil rights investigation, led by Special Agent Warren, expanded from reviewing Sullivan's single assault to examining department-wide patterns of excessive force and discriminatory policing. Federal investigators obtained 3 years of arrest records, use of force reports and complaint files, discovering systematic patterns that Sullivan's case exemplified but didn't encompass. We've identified 47 officers with multiple excessive force complaints that were dismissed without adequate investigation. Warren reported during a press conference announcing federal intervention. Officer Sullivan's assault on Chief Hunter exposed a culture of impunity that protected constitutional violations rather than preventing them. The Justice Department filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city, demanding a consent decree requiring federal oversight of the police department for at least 5 years. The agreement would mandate comprehensive reforms, including use of force policy revisions, bias training, early warning systems for problem officers, and independent civilian oversight of misconduct investigations. Officer Sullivan faced both criminal and civil consequences. The county prosecutor, recognizing that video evidence made conviction likely, filed felony assault charges and federal civil rights violations. Sullivan's attorney attempted to argue qualified immunity, but Hunter's status as an experienced law enforcement officer who posed no threat undermined claims that Sullivan's actions were reasonable. The defendant attacked his own police chief while that chief was peacefully exercising his constitutional rights. The prosecutor argued during preliminary hearings, if the chief of police isn't safe from this officer's violence, what chance do ordinary citizens have? Sullivan was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, a sentence that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. The conviction of a police officer for assaulting his own chief created legal precedent that prosecutors could cite when pursuing excessive force cases against other officers. Sergeant Bradshaw faced termination for his role in approving Sullivan's deficient arrest report and failing to question obvious constitutional violations. The internal affairs investigation revealed he had routinely dismissed complaints against officers under his supervision, creating a protective culture that enabled misconduct. Deputy Chief Fisher, while not directly involved in Hunter's assault, was demoted after the investigation revealed systematic failure to supervise problem officers. His defensive posture toward reform and loyalty to the old guard culture made him incompatible with Hunter's vision for the department. The police union, which had initially attempted to defend Sullivan, faced membership revolt when rank-and-file officers realized the protective culture actually hurt their professional reputation and made their jobs more dangerous. By eroding community trust, we need a union that protects good officers doing difficult work, not one that shields bad officers committing crimes. veteran officer Raymond Tucker told union leadership during a contentious meeting. His sentiment reflected growing recognition among conscientious officers that accountability actually strengthened rather than weakened law enforcement. The union elected new leadership committed to working with Chief Hunter on reforms that balanced officer safety with constitutional policing. The shift represented a fundamental change in how the union understood its role, protecting legitimate law enforcement activities rather than defending indefensible misconduct. Most significantly, the incident catalyzed comprehensive policy changes that extended far beyond punishing individual officers. Hunter implemented new use of force policies, emphasizing de-escalation, required all officers to complete constitutional policing training, established an early warning system to identify problem officers before their misconduct escalated, and created genuine civilian oversight with subpoena power and independent investigative authority. What happened to me personally was terrible, Hunter told a community forum 3 months after taking command. But it exposed systematic failures that were harming this community long before I arrived. We're using this moment to build the department Riverside City deserves. The systematic consequences extended beyond Riverside City. Police departments nationwide studied the case as an example of how excessive force could occur even against law enforcement professionals, highlighting the importance of constitutional training and accountability mechanisms. The transformation wasn't just punitive. Hunter also celebrated officers who exemplified constitutional policing. Officer Raymond Tucker received commendation for his years of service without a single sustained complaint, demonstrating that professional law enforcement and community respect were compatible goals. 1 year after Officer Sullivan's assault became the catalyst for comprehensive reform, Chief Isaiah Hunter stood before the Riverside City Council, presenting his department's annual report. The transformation over 12 months had been remarkable, though the work of cultural change remained ongoing. Crime rates had decreased by 18%, while use of force incidents had dropped by 52%, statistics that refuted the false choice between constitutional policing and public safety. The data proved that properly trained officers using de-escalation tactics and community partnership actually improved law enforcement outcomes. We've demonstrated that respecting constitutional rights doesn't make communities less safe, Hunter explained to the council. It makes communities more safe because residents trust officers enough to cooperate with investigations and report crimes. The department's transformation had been comprehensive but challenging. Of the 247 officers who were serving when Hunter took command, 37 had resigned rather than adapt to the new standards of accountability. Most were officers with multiple complaints who recognized they couldn't continue operating with impunity. But the majority of officers had embraced the reforms, recognizing that constitutional policing actually made their jobs safer and more professionally rewarding. Community cooperation increased when residents viewed officers as protectors rather than threats, making investigations more successful and reducing confrontations that could escalate to violence. Captain Monica Reeves, promoted to deputy chief after Fisher's demotion, had become Hunter's strongest ally in implementing cultural transformation. As a reform-minded leader who had been marginalized under the previous administration, she understood both the department's problems and the pathways to improvement. Officers are discovering that treating people with dignity doesn't make us weak, Reeves explained during a training session. It makes us effective. Citizens who trust us, provide information, cooperate with investigations, and support our legitimate law enforcement activities. The early warning system Hunter implemented had identified 12 officers whose patterns of complaints suggested they needed intervention before their behavior escalated to Sullivan's level. Rather than waiting for constitutional violations, the department now provided coaching, retraining, and if necessary, reassignment to non-patrol duties. We're getting ahead of problems instead of reacting after damage is done, Lieutenant Jennings explained to visiting police chiefs studying Riverside City's transformation. Early intervention protects both citizens and officers. The Civilian Oversight Commission, now empowered with genuine investigative authority, had reviewed 127 use-of-force incidents in the past year. Most were found justified under the new constitutional standards, but 15 required additional officer training and 3 resulted in discipline, a dramatic change from the previous culture where virtually no force was ever questioned. Hunter's personal experience as a victim of excessive force gave him moral authority that no traditional chief could match. When he discussed constitutional policing, officers couldn't dismiss his concerns as academic theory disconnected from street realities. "I've been where you are," Hunter told officers during training sessions. "I've made split-second decisions in dangerous situations. But I've also experienced what happens when officers abuse their authority. That perspective informs everything I ask of you." The transformation extended beyond policy to relationships. Hunter had established regular community forums where residents could discuss concerns directly with command staff, creating accountability mechanisms that supplemented formal complaint processes. Ahmad Hassan, the store owner who had recorded Hunter's assault, now served on the Civilian Oversight Commission. His presence symbolized the department's commitment to community partnership rather than defensive antagonism toward accountability. Chief Hunter could have responded to his assault with anger and retaliation, Hassan told community members. Instead, he used it to build a better department that serves all of us more effectively. The most meaningful transformation was perhaps in how officers viewed their role. Instead of seeing themselves as warriors battling community threats, they increasingly understood their mission as guardians serving community needs. The shift in mindset reduced confrontations and improved outcomes. Hunter's family had adjusted to Riverside City, with his wife Angela serving on the health department's police wellness committee and his children becoming advocates for community police partnership in their schools. "My dad's assault was terrible," his daughter Naomi told her civics class. "But watching him transform that trauma into positive change taught me that we can either let bad experiences defeat us or use them to make things better for everyone." The national recognition Hunter received, including the NAACP's Law Enforcement Leadership Award and the International Association of Chiefs of Police Excellence in Leadership citation, validated the transformation. But Hunter remained focused on the daily work of cultural change rather than external accolades. Awards are nice, but the real measure of success is whether citizens feel safer and whether officers can do their jobs with community support, Hunter reflected. "We're building that trust one interaction at a time." 3 years after Officer Sullivan's assault inadvertently launched comprehensive police reform, Riverside City unveiled the Constitutional Policing Training Center, a facility dedicated to teaching law enforcement professionals nationwide the principles that had transformed the city's police department from a symbol of excessive force to a model of community-oriented policing. Chief Isaiah Hunter stood at the dedication ceremony, reflecting on a journey that had begun with personal victimization but had evolved into systematic change affecting law enforcement practices far beyond one department. 3 years ago, I experienced firsthand what happens when police culture prioritizes authority over accountability, Hunter told the assembled crowd of law enforcement professionals, city officials, and community members. That painful experience became the foundation for building a department that respects constitutional rights while effectively protecting public safety. The training center would teach the methodologies developed in Riverside City, de-escalation techniques, bias recognition, constitutional policing standards, and community partnership strategies. Police departments from across the nation had already committed to sending officers for training. recognizing that Riverside City's approach produced measurable improvements in both safety outcomes and community trust. Garrett Sullivan, who had served 2 years of his 4-year sentence before being released on parole, attended the ceremony at Hunter's invitation. His presence was controversial, but Hunter believed in redemption for those who genuinely transformed their understanding and behavior. I destroyed my career and harmed my community through actions I thought were acceptable because the department culture protected them, Sullivan told attendees during a presentation about accountability. Chief Hunter could have simply punished me and moved on. Instead, he used my misconduct to create systems that prevent other officers from making the same mistakes. Sullivan now worked as a civilian instructor in the training center, teaching officers about the consequences of excessive force and the importance of constitutional restraints. His transformation from abusive officer to accountability advocate demonstrated that cultural change could extend even to those who had been most resistant. The systematic reforms implemented in Riverside City had produced remarkable results. Crime rates had decreased by 31% over 3 years, while use of force incidents had dropped by 68%. Most significantly, community surveys showed that 73% of residents now trusted the police department, up from 31% before Hunter's arrival. The numbers prove that constitutional policing and public safety are complementary goals, not competing priorities, Mayor Brennan explained during her remarks. Riverside City is safer because residents trust officers enough to cooperate with legitimate law enforcement. The FBI had closed its investigation after implementing the consent decree that required federal oversight of the department for 5 years. Agent Warren, who had led the civil rights investigation, praised the department's transformation while noting the importance of continued vigilance. Riverside City demonstrates what's possible when leadership commits to genuine reform, Warren told reporters. But maintaining these improvements requires constant attention to culture, training, and accountability. The police union's transformation had been equally significant. New leadership had partnered with Hunter to develop contracts that protected officers performing their duties constitutionally while allowing discipline for misconduct. The shift represented a maturation in how the union understood its role. "We protect good officers doing difficult work," explained Union President Sarah Mitchell, who had replaced Dennis Crawford. "We don't protect bad officers committing crimes. That distinction has made us stronger and more respected." Captain Reeves, now Deputy Chief and Hunter's second-in-command, had become a national voice for women in law enforcement leadership. Her partnership with Hunter demonstrated that diverse command staff brought different perspectives that strengthened departmental effectiveness. Chief Hunter's experience as a victim gave him insights that traditional chiefs never develop, Reeves explained to a law enforcement conference. His willingness to use that trauma constructively rather than defensively created space for genuine transformation. Ahmad Hassan had expanded his convenience store into a small chain, using his business success to fund youth programs that connected young people with police officers through mentorship rather than confrontation. His evolution from documenting abuse to building community partnerships symbolized the broader transformation. The Civilian Oversight Commission had become a model for other cities, demonstrating that genuine community accountability could coexist with effective law enforcement when designed properly and supported by leadership committed to constitutional principles. Most significantly, the case had established legal precedents that prosecutors nationwide cited when pursuing excessive force cases. Sullivan's conviction for assaulting his own chief created jurisprudence, making it harder for officers to claim qualified immunity for obvious constitutional violations. The Sullivan case proved that even police chiefs aren't safe from excessive force when officers operate without accountability, explained civil rights attorney Lawrence Hunter, who had leveraged his brother's case into broader advocacy for police reform. That reality focused attention on the importance of systematic accountability mechanisms. As the ceremony concluded, Hunter walked through the training center with his family, past exhibits showing the transformation of Riverside City's police department from a case study in dysfunction to a model for constitutional policing. His children, now older and more understanding of their father's work, reflected on how his assault had shaped their family's trajectory and the broader community's development. Dad could have been angry and vindictive after what happened, his son Elijah observed. Instead, he used it to make the whole system better. That's real leadership. Hunter's wife Angela, who had supported him through the trauma and the challenging work of departmental transformation, recognized how the experience had deepened his commitment to justice. "You always cared about constitutional policing," she told him quietly. "But experiencing violation firsthand gave you understanding that no amount of training could provide. You speak from the heart as well as the head now." As Hunter locked the training center that evening, he reflected on the journey from being handcuffed on a sidewalk to building an institution that would train thousands of officers in constitutional policing principles, the assault that could have been just another forgotten excessive force incident had become the catalyst for transformation affecting law enforcement practices nationwide. Officer Sullivan's moment of brutality had inadvertently exposed a broken system, and Hunter's response had demonstrated that systematic reform was possible when leaders chose accountability over defensiveness. The legacy extended beyond policies and training to a fundamental shift in how police understood their role, not as warriors imposing order, but as guardians serving communities through constitutional principles that respected human dignity while protecting public safety. The badge Hunter wore no longer represented just authority, but also accountability. Not just power, but also responsibility to use that power constitutionally. And the department he commanded had evolved from a culture protecting misconduct to one modeling how law enforcement could serve diverse communities with both effectiveness and integrity. 3 years after being assaulted by one of his own officers, Chief Isaiah Hunter had transformed personal trauma into institutional change that would protect countless citizens from similar abuse while supporting officers committed to serving their communities with honor and constitutional fidelity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.